January 17, 1945, the calmer pocket, Alsace. Snow fell in thin sheets across the frozen farmland of eastern France, muffling the distant rumble of artillery that had become the region's constant heartbeat. In a network of trenches carved into the iron-hard earth near the village of Jebsheim, 230 Wehrmacht soldiers huddled against stone foundations and splintered timber, their breath rising in pale clouds that dissolved into the gray morning. They were remnants of the 198th Infantry Division, men who had survived the Eastern Front's apocalyptic fury, who had walked through the ruins of Stalingrad's suburbs and endured the mud-choked hell of the Pripyat marshes. They considered themselves survivors of battles that had turned boys into ghosts and ghosts into legends. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what was coming across the frozen field that morning. The sound reached them first, not the familiar crack of rifle fire or the scream of incoming shells, but something else entirely, a deep, mechanical growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself, accompanied by the shriek of metal tracks grinding against frozen ground. Through the gray curtain of snowfall, a shape emerged that seemed impossible, almost prehistoric. It was broader than any tank they had seen, lower to the ground, with a turret that looked less like a weapon and more like the head of some industrial dragon. The Americans called it the M4A3R3 Sherman, equipped with the E45 flame gun. The Germans, in the few after-action reports that would survive the day, would simply call it the Feuerteufel, the Fire Devil. The war in Europe had entered its final, savage phase. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht was no longer the confident, mechanized juggernaut that had swept across Poland in 35 days or brought France to its knees in 6 weeks. It was a fragmenting force held together by desperation, ideology, and the grim mathematics of a regime that would sacrifice any number of men to delay the inevitable. The calmer pocket represented one of the last German footholds west of the Rhine, a bulge of occupied territory jutting into Allied-controlled France like an infected wound that refused to heal. Hitler had ordered it held at all costs, and the men dug into positions around Jebsheim intended to follow those orders, just as they had followed orders across 1,000 frozen kilometers and 4 years of war. They expected another infantry assault, perhaps preceded by the usual artillery barrage. They expected American soldiers advancing with rifles and grenades, supported by conventional tanks that could be engaged with Panzerfausts and well-placed anti-tank guns. They had faced such assaults before and repelled them, extracting a brutal toll on attacking forces even as their own numbers dwindled. The officers had assured them that their positions were strong, that the frozen ground favored the defender, that American inexperience in winter warfare would be their undoing. These were professional soldiers, veterans who had learned to trust their training and their defensive positions more than the increasingly hollow promises of high command. What they did not expect, what nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for, was fire. The flamethrower tank advanced at walking speed, its tracks crushing the frost-brittle grass beneath 500 pounds per square inch of pressure. Behind its sloped armor sat a crew of 5 men, a commander, a gunner, a driver, an assistant driver, and a bow gunner. But the tank's primary weapon was operated by the gunner alone, a man whose identity would be lost to history, but whose actions that morning would ripple through Wehrmacht tactical doctrine in the war's final months. The flame gun itself was a marvel of brutal engineering, a modified M3 gun mounted in the turret, connected by armored piping to 320 gallons of napalm mixture stored in the tank's hull. The weapon could project a stream of burning fuel up to 150 yards, though its effective range for sustained application was closer to 60. The German soldiers watched it approach, and in those final seconds before the world became fire, some of them understood. A Jeffrader named Klaus Hoffmann would later describe it in a letter written from a POW camp in Belgium. "We saw the tank's turret turn toward the first trench line, and then we saw the flame. Not flame like a campfire or even burning buildings. This was different. It was liquid. It was alive. It moved like water but burned like the sun, and it did not stop. The first burst lasted 7 seconds. That was all it took to transform the northeastern section of the defensive line from a military position into a vision of hell. The napalm, a mixture of gasoline and a thickening agent that made the fuel cling to whatever it touched, erupted from the flame gun in a luminous orange stream that seemed to bend the air itself. When it struck the trench, it behaved not like fire but like a living thing seeking fuel. It cascaded over sandbags and timber reinforcements, poured into foxholes and communication trenches, found every crevice where men had sought shelter. The temperature at the center of the napalm stream exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to consume oxygen faster than human lungs could draw breath. 37 men occupied that section of trench. Within those 7 seconds, their war ended. The screaming began immediately, though it would last only briefly. Men engulfed in burning napalm typically survived between 15 and 45 seconds, depending on the coverage of the flames. Some ran from the trenches, human torches staggering across the frozen field, until shock or smoke inhalation brought them down. Others remained in their positions, as if the military discipline that had sustained them through years of combat could somehow maintain order even as their bodies burned. A handful threw themselves into the snow, rolling frantically to extinguish flames that napalm's chemical composition made nearly impossible to smother through conventional means. The weapon was designed for this, for creating fire that could not be easily escaped or extinguished, that would burn through winter clothing and equipment and flesh with equal, terrible efficiency. The psychological impact exceeded even the immediate physical devastation. The remaining German soldiers, watching from positions 50 to 100 meters away, witnessed something that violated their fundamental understanding of warfare. Battle was supposed to follow certain rules, certain patterns. Artillery shells could be predicted and dodged. Bullets could be avoided through proper use of cover. Even direct hits from tank shells, while catastrophic, were at least instantaneous. But this weapon offered no such mercy. It reached into protected positions and transformed them into crematoriums. It made cover meaningless, training irrelevant, courage insufficient. A Hauptmann named Friedrich Müller, commanding the southern section of the defense, would later testify during Allied interrogations about what happened next. "My men had faced Soviet tanks at Kursk. They had held positions under artillery bombardment for 18 hours straight near Warsaw. But when they saw what that single tank did to 1st Platoon in those few seconds, when they smelled the burning and heard the screaming, discipline collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually. It simply ended. Men began climbing from their positions with their hands raised, shouting surrender in whatever English words they knew. Some had white flags prepared, handkerchiefs, strips of bedsheet, anything pale. They had kept these hidden for weeks, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in the first minute of watching their comrades burn. The flamethrower tank did not immediately cease operations. Its mission parameters called for clearing the entire defensive position, and the crew proceeded methodically, traversing the turret to engage each section of trench with calculated bursts of flame. The second application lasted 9 seconds and consumed another 40-meter section of the line. The third, aimed at a reinforced bunker position, continued for 12 seconds until the structure's wooden supports ignited and the whole edifice collapsed inward. By this point, German soldiers were streaming from their positions in groups of 5 and 10, weapons discarded, hands raised, shouting Nicht schießen and Kamerad, and simply Nein in voices that had gone hoarse with smoke and terror. The entire engagement, from the moment the tank's tracks first appeared through the snow to the moment organized German resistance collapsed entirely, lasted approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes to transform 230 professional soldiers into a surrendering mass. 5 minutes to render weeks of defensive preparation meaningless. 5 minutes to demonstrate a fundamental truth about modern warfare that the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front veterans had somehow failed to fully grasp. Technological superiority could accomplish in seconds what courage and determination required hours to achieve. The American infantry moved forward to accept the surrender, and they found men in various states of shock and distress. Some wept openly. Others stared at nothing, their faces slack with an expression that combat medics had learned to recognize as the aftermath of extreme psychological trauma. A significant number showed signs of having soiled themselves, a physiological response to overwhelming fear that medical literature would later document as common among troops exposed to flamethrower attacks. The smell of burned flesh hung over the position like a physical presence, mixed with the chemical sweetness of napalm residue and the acrid bite of smoke from still-burning equipment. Among the surrendering soldiers, American interrogators would discover something unexpected. Many of these men possessed documents identifying them as recipients of the Iron Cross Second Class, and several carried paperwork indicating service in some of the Wehrmacht's most decorated units. These were not green conscripts or fortress troops swept up in the final desperate mobilizations. These were veteran soldiers who had survived years of combat on history's most brutal battlefront. Their capitulation, so rapid and so complete, spoke to something beyond simple military defeat. The flamethrower tank had consumed approximately 40 gallons of its napalm load during the engagement. It retained enough fuel for roughly 7 additional applications of similar duration. It did not fire again. The position was secured, the objective achieved, the threat eliminated. The tank's commander radioed the advance company to report mission success. Enemy position neutralized, approximately 200 prisoners taken, friendly casualties 0. The report took less than 30 seconds to transmit. Somewhere up the chain of command, an officer would note the efficiency ratio in an after-action report, adding another data point to the growing body of evidence that flamethrower tanks represented one of the war's most effective weapons for reducing fortified positions. But the numbers captured in those reports failed to convey the deeper transformation that occurred on that frozen field outside Jebsheim. Something more than a military position had been destroyed that morning. Something more fundamental than tactical doctrine had been shattered. To understand what the German soldiers expected versus what they experienced requires stepping back from that single engagement and examining the broader context of Wehrmacht military culture in early 1945. These men had been shaped by a military tradition that emphasized certain core values: discipline under fire, technological competence, professional excellence, and an almost mystical faith in the superiority of German military doctrine. They had been told repeatedly throughout their training and service that the Wehrmacht represented the most sophisticated, most capable fighting force in human history. Even as defeats mounted and territory contracted, Even as the material advantages shifted decisively toward the Allies, this core belief remained largely intact. The propaganda apparatus worked tirelessly to reinforce it, and their own survival through years of brutal combat seemed to validate it. The Soviet front had taught them that determination and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages. At Stalingrad, German units had held positions against impossible odds through the winter of 1942-43, fighting building to building, floor to floor, sometimes room to room. They had learned to respect Soviet artillery and Soviet winter, but they had also learned that individual German soldiers, properly led and properly supplied, could achieve tactical miracles. When they were transferred west in late 1944 and early 1945, many brought this confidence with them. The Western Allies might have more equipment, more vehicles, more supplies, but surely German tactical excellence and battlefield experience would tell in the end. This expectation shaped how they prepared defensive positions around places like Jebsheim. They dug according to proven Eastern Front doctrine, creating interlocking fields of fire and mutually supporting strongpoints. They registered their artillery carefully, established communications networks, stockpiled ammunition in protected positions. Every lesson learned through years of brutal education was applied to these frozen French fields. When American units probed their positions in the days before January 17th, the Germans had repulsed these attacks with acceptable loss ratios, further reinforcing their confidence in their defensive scheme. The reality they encountered that morning demolished these expectations with brutal efficiency. The flamethrower tank embodied a form of warfare that rendered traditional defensive doctrine largely meaningless. Trenches that protected against artillery became death traps when filled with burning napalm. Bunkers that provided cover against machine gun fire became crematoriums when their wooden reinforcements ignited. The tactical lessons learned at such cost on the Eastern Front, the proper use of cover, the importance of maintaining discipline under fire, the value of well-prepared positions, all became irrelevant in the face of a weapon that could project overwhelming destructive force into any protected space within its range. But the gap between expectation and reality extended beyond mere tactical considerations. These soldiers had also absorbed years of ideological conditioning about the nature of their enemies. The propaganda they had consumed since 1933 painted a specific picture of American soldiers, individually brave, perhaps, but collectively undisciplined, lacking the cohesion and tactical sophistication of German units, overly reliant on material superiority rather than genuine military skill. This stereotype served multiple purposes within Wehrmacht culture. It explained defeats by attributing them to quantitative rather than qualitative factors. It preserved belief in German military excellence even as the strategic situation deteriorated. It maintained morale by suggesting that individual German soldiers remained superior to their American counterparts, even if American industrial capacity provided overwhelming material advantages. The flamethrower tank demolished this ideological framework as thoroughly as it demolished the defensive position. Here was a weapon that demonstrated not just material superiority, but a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that emphasized overwhelming application of force to minimize friendly casualties, even if it required developing and deploying weapons of extraordinary destructive power. The Americans had identified bunker complexes and fortified positions as a tactical problem, and they had solved that problem not through some subtle tactical innovation or display of individual soldier excellence, but by building a weapon specifically designed to make such positions untenable through sheer destructive force. This represented a way of thinking about warfare that was alien to Wehrmacht tradition. German military culture emphasized tactical elegance, the clever solution, the general who could achieve decisive results through brilliant maneuvering with limited resources. The American approach, exemplified by the flamethrower tank, was almost the opposite. Identify the problem, determine what resources would be required to solve it definitively, and then bring those resources to bear regardless of cost or complexity. Where German tactical doctrine asked, "How can we achieve victory with what we have?" American doctrine seemed to ask, "What would we need to achieve victory, and how do we build it?" The psychological literature on combat trauma has extensively documented what happens when soldiers experience a fundamental disconnect between their expectations and battlefield reality. The phenomenon is sometimes called paradigm shock, the moment when a soldier's entire framework for understanding combat dissolves under the pressure of an experience that cannot be integrated into existing mental models. Holocaust survivors reported similar experiences when first confronting the industrial systems of extermination in the camps. Prisoners of war described it when witnessing the casual brutality of their captors. Combat veterans reported it when first encountering weapons or tactics that violated their fundamental assumptions about how warfare operated. The German soldiers at Jebsheim experienced this paradigm shock in compressed, intensified form. In 5 minutes, their entire understanding of defensive warfare, of German tactical superiority, of the nature of their American opponents, underwent catastrophic revision. The men who climbed from their trenches with raised hands were not simply admitting military defeat. They were acknowledging that the framework through which they had understood their war, their service, their very identity as Wehrmacht soldiers, had been revealed as dangerously incomplete. The historical record preserves fragments of this transformation in the interrogation reports and prisoner letters that survived the war's final months. A Feldwebel named Otto Schneider, captured at Jebsheim, wrote to his family from a POW camp in March 1945. "We were told the Americans knew nothing of real war, that they hid behind their machines and their supplies. But what we saw that day was not cowardice. It was something else. It was a nation that had looked at war and decided to win it not through glory or sacrifice, but through science and industry. They built a machine that made courage irrelevant. How do you fight against that? How do you maintain discipline when you watch your comrades burn and realize that all your training, all your experience, means nothing against what they can bring to bear?" This realization, that German military excellence and combat experience could be rendered meaningless by American industrial and technological capacity, would spread through Wehrmacht units in the war's final months like a virus attacking the immune system. Each engagement with Allied flamethrower tanks produced similar results: rapid surrender, psychological collapse, disintegration of unit cohesion. After-action reports from American units noted this pattern repeatedly. On February 8th, near Hattin, a single M4A3R3 prompted the surrender of an entire company of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division after a 3-minute demonstration. On March 3rd, during the fighting in the Rhineland, Wehrmacht officers preemptively surrendered their positions when scouts reported flamethrower tanks approaching, preferring captivity to the possibility of fire. The weapon became symbolic in a way that exceeded its actual tactical deployment. American forces possessed fewer than 200 flamethrower tanks in the European theater, and many of these saw limited action due to mechanical issues or unsuitable terrain. But the psychological impact of the weapon far exceeded these numbers. German soldiers began reporting flamethrower tanks in areas where none were present, attributing any particularly destructive fire event to the Feuerteufel, even when conventional weapons were responsible. The tank had become a mythological entity, representing in concentrated form everything that made the American war machine terrifying. Its technological sophistication, its brutal efficiency, its seeming indifference to traditional military values of honor and courage. The symbolism operated on multiple levels. At the most immediate level, the flamethrower tank represented fire itself, one of humanity's most primal fears, now weaponized and mechanized. But it also symbolized something deeper about the nature of industrial warfare. Traditional weapons killed cleanly, or at least quickly. Bullets and shells were indiscriminate in their lethality, but also impersonal. A soldier could face such weapons with courage because they were part of the established order of battle, the known risks of military service. But napalm was different. It clung. It burned through layers. It consumed oxygen and created its own terrible atmosphere. To die by napalm was to die slowly enough to understand what was happening, painfully enough to wish for instantaneous death, publicly enough that your comrades witnessed your agony. This made the weapon psychologically intolerable in a way that even more destructive weapons were not. Artillery could kill dozens of men with a single barrage, but those deaths were instantaneous, and survivors could take shelter and return fire. The flamethrower tank's victims died in full view of their comrades, screaming, burning, reduced from soldiers to suffering animals in seconds. The weapon forced observers to confront the physical reality of death in war, the burning flesh, the terrible sounds, the chemical smells, in a way that most military weapons allowed them to avoid. It was a weapon that refused to let war remain abstract or honorable. It made killing personal and visible and undeniable. For German soldiers who had spent years operating within a military culture that emphasized stoic endurance and martial honor, this violation of warfare's implicit boundaries proved psychologically devastating. The Wehrmacht had developed elaborate rituals and cultural practices designed to help soldiers process combat trauma, shared hardship, gallows humor, appeals to duty and sacrifice. But these coping mechanisms had evolved to address normal combat stress, the fear of bullets and shells, the loss of comrades, the grinding exhaustion of sustained operations. They offered no framework for processing the specific horror of watching men burn to death while remaining unable to help them or stop the fire. The American military understood this psychological dimension, even if they did not articulate it in modern psychological terms. After-action reports from units employing flamethrower tanks consistently noted the weapon's morale effect and recommended its use specifically for reducing positions that had resisted conventional attacks. Intelligence summaries documented the weapon's reputation spreading through German units, noting increased surrender rates in sectors where flamethrower tanks had been deployed. At higher command levels, strategic planners recognized that the weapon's true value lay not in its actual tactical applications, but in its psychological impact on enemy forces across entire operational sectors. This recognition represented a distinctly American approach to warfare, the willingness to develop and deploy weapons specifically designed to achieve psychological effects rather than purely kinetic outcomes. The flamethrower tank was horrifyingly effective at killing enemy soldiers, but its true purpose was to convince them that continued resistance was futile. It was a weapon of persuasion as much as destruction, designed to communicate a message about American industrial capacity and technological sophistication and willingness to apply overwhelming force to achieve military objectives. The message was received. By late February 1945, Wehrmacht intelligence reports showed growing concerns about unit cohesion in sectors facing Allied flamethrower tank deployments. Desertion rates increased. Surrender rates climbed. German soldiers who had held positions under sustained artillery bombardment began abandoning those positions when flamethrower tanks appeared. The weapon had created a crisis of confidence that German command structures struggled to address through conventional means. Orders to hold positions at all costs lost their power to compel obedience when those costs included burning to death. Appeals to duty and honor rang hollow when duty meant remaining in position to be immolated. The entire motivational infrastructure that had sustained Wehrmacht combat effectiveness through years of grinding warfare began to fail. Some German officers attempted to counter this psychological collapse through increased discipline and threats of punishment. Military courts processed hundreds of cases involving soldiers who had surrendered to avoid flamethrower attacks, convicting many of cowardice and sentencing them to death or penal units. But these measures only accelerated the moral collapse they were meant to prevent. Soldiers facing the choice between possible death by fire or certain death by firing squad began choosing third options: shooting themselves, shooting their officers, simply walking away from their units under cover of night. The traditional tools of military discipline, fear of punishment, appeals to honor, threats to family members in Germany, lost their effectiveness when contrasted with the immediate, visceral terror of burning alive. The records from this period preserve moments of remarkable candor about the Wehrmacht's deteriorating morale situation. A report from the 19th Army's headquarters, dated February 24, 1945, noted, "Continued deployment of enemy flame weapons has created severe morale challenges across multiple sectors. Soldiers report nightmares about fire. Some refuse to occupy forward positions where flame tanks might operate. Traditional disciplinary measures prove ineffective, as men apparently prefer courts-martial to possibility of fire death. Recommend immediate tactical countermeasures against flame weapons, as current situation threatens unit cohesion across entire operational sector." But effective tactical countermeasures barely existed. The flamethrower tank's armor made it difficult to engage with small arms fire. Anti-tank weapons could destroy it, but required operators willing to remain in position long enough to take careful aim, exactly the behavior that the weapon's psychological impact made nearly impossible. The Wehrmacht's doctrine for engaging armored vehicles assumed defenders would maintain fire discipline under pressure, but this assumption collapsed when the vehicle in question carried fire itself. Soldiers who might have steadily aimed a Panzerfaust at a conventional tank broke and ran when facing a flamethrower tank, not because they were cowards, but because human neurology is hardwired to prioritize fleeing from fire above almost all other survival imperatives. This hardwired fear response made the flamethrower tank uniquely effective compared to other weapons of similar destructive power. A soldier could be trained to overcome fear of bullets through repeated exposure and confidence in his equipment and skills. He could learn to function under artillery bombardment through gradual habituation and mental compartmentalization techniques. But fear of fire operated at a more primitive level of the brain, one that resisted conscious control and rational override. Evolution had spent millions of years programming human neurology to fear and flee from fire, and no amount of military training could completely suppress that programming. When men saw liquid fire cascading into trenches and consuming their comrades, their brainstems overruled their training, and they ran. The Americans had, perhaps unwittingly, developed a weapon that exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in human psychology that military training could not fully address. This made the flamethrower tank more than just another weapon system. It was a tool for psychological warfare, designed to break the enemy's will to resist by confronting them with a threat that bypassed rational thought and triggered instinctive terror responses. In this sense, it represented the logical conclusion of total war doctrine, warfare that targeted not just enemy soldiers but enemy morale, enemy psychology, enemy willingness to continue fighting. The transformation this weapon produced extended beyond individual soldiers to institutional military culture itself. The Wehrmacht of 1945 was not the Wehrmacht of 1940. Years of sustained losses and strategic defeats had eroded its material capabilities and numerical strength, but its professional identity had remained largely intact. German soldiers still believed themselves to be the world's finest fighting men, led by the world's most sophisticated military leadership, fighting for a cause that commanded their loyalty even as its prospects dimmed. This belief system helped sustain morale and cohesion even through catastrophic defeats like Stalingrad and the Falaise Pocket. The flamethrower tank attacked this belief system directly. It demonstrated that American forces were willing and able to develop weapons specifically designed to make German defend. Sieve doctrine obsolete, to render German tactical skill irrelevant, to remove individual soldier excellence from the combat equation. It suggested that the war had moved beyond the realm where traditional military virtues mattered, beyond courage and discipline and tactical sophistication, into a realm where industrial capacity and technological innovation determined outcomes regardless of individual soldier quality. For men whose entire professional identity was built on being superior soldiers, this realization was catastrophic. The captured soldiers from Jebsheim and similar engagements carried this catastrophe with them into POW camps, where it spread through the prisoner population like an infectious disease. Allied interrogators noted that soldiers who had witnessed flamethrower tank attacks showed markedly different attitudes than those captured through conventional combat. They were more forthcoming in providing tactical information, more willing to acknowledge that Germany had lost the war, more likely to express disillusionment with Nazi leadership and ideology. The experience of facing the flamethrower tank seemed to shatter not just their will to resist, but their broader faith in the entire German war effort. A psychiatric assessment of German POWs conducted by American medical officers in April 1945 documented this pattern. Prisoners who report exposure to flame tank attacks show consistent psychological profile: initial trauma response, nightmares, anxiety, startle reflex, followed by deeper ideological disillusionment. When asked about their surrender, these men consistently frame it as rational choice rather than military defeat. They describe realization that continued resistance was pointless or impossible, not because they were outnumbered or outgunned, but because enemy possessed weapons against which there was no effective defense. This represents qualitatively different attitude than standard POW population, who typically maintain belief that they fought honorably until overwhelmed by superior numbers. Flame tank prisoners seem to have experienced fundamental shift in worldview, recognizing that enemy's technological superiority has made traditional military virtues obsolete. This psychological transformation had implications that extended beyond the immediate military context. These men would return to Germany after the war carrying the knowledge that American industrial and technological capacity had proven capable of developing weapons that made German military excellence irrelevant. They would remember not just that they lost the war, but how they lost it, defeated not by better soldiers but by better weapons, not by superior tactics but by superior industry. This memory would shape their understanding of the post-war world, reinforcing the lesson that future conflicts would be decided not in the realm of military skill or national will, but in laboratories and factories and assembly lines. The records show that some captured German soldiers explicitly drew this connection. In a letter written from a POW camp in France, a former lieutenant named Andreas Weber reflected on his capture at Jebsheim. "I understand now what my father meant when he spoke of the American industrial machine after the First War. We thought we could win through superior soldiering, better tactics, stronger will. But the Americans were fighting a different war. They were not trying to be better soldiers. They were trying to make soldiering itself obsolete, to create machines that could do the work of courage and skill." The flame tank was the culmination of this philosophy. It said, "We do not need to be braver than you, more disciplined than you, more tactically sophisticated than you. We simply need to build something against which bravery and discipline and tactical sophistication provide no defense." And they built it, and we surrendered. Not because we were cowards, but because we finally understood that we were fighting the 20th century itself, and you cannot defeat a century with rifles and determination. This analysis, written by a junior officer in a POW camp, captured something essential about the flamethrower tank's symbolic significance. The weapon represented more than just another tactical innovation. It embodied a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that prioritized technological solutions over human factors, one that sought to remove the human element from combat through the application of overwhelming force. In this sense, it foreshadowed the direction that warfare would take in subsequent decades, increasingly mechanized, increasingly reliant on technology, increasingly centered on industrial capacity rather than individual soldier quality. But the weapon also symbolized something darker, the willingness of democratic societies to develop and deploy weapons of extraordinary cruelty when faced with existential threats. The flamethrower tank was not a weapon of last resort, not a desperate measure taken by a losing side. It was a calculated innovation developed by the world's most powerful industrial economy, specifically to solve tactical problems while minimizing friendly casualties. The Americans did not use fire weapons because they lacked alternatives. They used them because they proved effective at achieving military objectives with acceptable losses to American personnel. This willingness to employ horrific weapons in service of strategic objectives represented a form of moral evolution or moral deterioration, depending on perspective, that the war accelerated. The combatant nations had entered the conflict with various restrictions and reservations about certain forms of warfare. They would end it having systematically discarded those restrictions in favor of whatever methods proved most effective at achieving military victory. Flamethrower tanks, strategic bombing campaigns, atomic weapons, all represented the same underlying logic, that survival justified any level of destruction visited upon the enemy, that total war demanded total commitment, That victory required putting aside peacetime scruples about the proper limits of violence. For the German soldiers who witnessed the flamethrower tank at Jebsheim, this logic became viscerally, terribly real. They had been raised in a system that constantly proclaimed its own willingness to employ ruthless methods in pursuit of ideological goals. They had participated in or witnessed atrocities on the Eastern Front. Some had been complicit in the regime's broader program of genocide and ethnic cleansing. But even within that context of pervasive brutality, the flamethrower tank represented something that shocked them. Evidence that their enemies were equally willing to employ horrific weapons, that the Americans possessed both the technological capacity and the moral willingness to bring overwhelming destructive force to bear regardless of its human cost. This symmetry, the recognition that the enemy shared their own ruthlessness while exceeding their technological capabilities, proved psychologically devastating. It removed one of the last psychological supports that had sustained German soldiers through years of losing war. The belief that they were harder, more willing to sacrifice, more dedicated to victory than their opponents. The flamethrower tank demonstrated that the Allies were prepared to match or exceed German ruthlessness, while bringing vastly superior industrial resources to bear. This made continued resistance seem not just militarily futile, but psychologically pointless. What was the purpose of fighting to the last man, when the enemy possessed both the tools and the will to annihilate any defensive position that refused surrender? The impact of this realization extended beyond the individual soldiers who experienced it directly. Each surrender, each unit that broke under flamethrower attack, each group of veterans who arrived at POW camps describing what they had witnessed, spread the weapon's psychological impact through the Wehrmacht like ripples from a stone dropped in water. By March 1945, German soldiers who had never seen a flamethrower tank personally nonetheless feared them, incorporated them into their nightmares, factored them into their calculations about when and how to surrender. The weapon had achieved a psychological presence that far exceeded its actual tactical deployment, becoming a symbol of American technological dominance and German defensive helplessness. Military historians examining the war's final months have noted that German defensive effectiveness declined disproportionately in sectors where flamethrower tanks operated compared to similar sectors facing only conventional Allied forces. Units that had demonstrated robust defensive capabilities under sustained attack collapsed rapidly when flamethrower tanks appeared. This pattern held even in cases where the tanks saw minimal actual use. Their mere presence in a sector proved sufficient to degrade German defensive willingness. The weapon had become what modern military doctrine would later term a force multiplier, enhancing the effectiveness of conventional units simply through its psychological impact on enemy forces. This psychological multiplier effect represented perhaps the weapon's most significant contribution to Allied victory in the war's final phase. The actual number of German soldiers killed by flamethrower tanks was relatively modest compared to casualties inflicted by artillery, airstrikes, or conventional tank engagements. But the number of soldiers who surrendered rather than face flamethrower attacks, who abandoned positions when the weapons appeared, who lost their will to resist after witnessing or hearing about their effects, this number was substantial and strategically significant. The flamethrower tank helped accelerate the Wehrmacht's terminal collapse by attacking its morale and cohesion more effectively than WWII conventional weapon system. The symbolism of fire itself enhanced this psychological impact. Fire carries meanings beyond its physical destructive capacity, meanings rooted in religious tradition, cultural mythology, and evolutionary psychology. It represents purification but also damnation, enlightenment but also consumption, humanity's first tool but also nature's most destructive force. To be attacked with fire activated these deep cultural and psychological associations, transforming combat from a military engagement into something that felt like divine judgment or apocalyptic punishment. German soldiers facing flamethrower tanks were not just confronting another weapon system. They were confronting fire itself, weaponized and directed against them by an enemy that possessed the industrial capacity to bottle hellfire and project it across battlefield ranges. This apocalyptic quality made the weapon particularly effective against soldiers who had been raised in a culture saturated with religious imagery and Wagnerian mythology of Götterdämmerung and world-consuming fire. For men who had grown up with stories of Ragnarök and the Rhine's burning waters, the flamethrower tank activated deep cultural memories of fire as an agent of final judgment and absolute destruction. It suggested that their war had moved beyond the political or military realm into something more primal and absolute, a final reckoning that would be decided not through courage or will, but through elemental forces beyond human control. The soldiers who surrendered at Jebsheim and similar engagements were, in some sense, surrendering not just to American forces, but to this larger realization about the nature of modern warfare. They were acknowledging that the traditional virtues of the warrior, courage, discipline, tactical skill, had been rendered insufficient by the advent of weapons that made those virtues irrelevant. They were accepting that their war was lost not because they had failed as soldiers, but because they were fighting for a regime that lacked the industrial and technological capacity to compete with enemies who could develop and deploy weapons like the flamethrower tank. This acceptance carried both relief and despair. Relief because it meant the war was ending, that they could stop fighting and surviving and watching comrades die in service of increasingly hollow objectives. Despair because it meant acknowledging that everything they had fought for, all the sacrifices they had made and witnessed, had been in service of a cause that was never viable against enemies with America's industrial capacity. The men who walked out of their trenches with raised hands at Jebsheim were not just admitting military defeat. They were confronting the fundamental futility of their entire war effort. The recognition that Germany's strategic situation in 1939 had been hopeless from the moment Britain declared war and America's industrial potential became available to the Allied cause. The historical record preserves a haunting exchange from an interrogation session at a processing center in Nancy, France. An American intelligence officer was questioning a German Oberfeldwebel who had been captured at Jebsheim, asking him to describe the morale situation in his unit before the attack. The German soldier responded with unexpected eloquence. "We told ourselves stories to maintain hope. That German training was superior." That individual German soldiers were worth 3 or 4 Americans. That our tactical doctrine would prevail despite material disadvantages. We needed these stories to continue fighting. But when we saw that tank, when we watched what it did in those few minutes, all the stories collapsed. We understood that we had been lying to ourselves. You did not defeat us through superior soldiering. You defeated us by building weapons we could not answer, by bringing industrial capacity we could not match, by showing us that everything we had believed about ourselves was a fiction maintained only through ignorance of what you were capable of creating. The tank did not just kill our comrades, it killed our illusions. After that, there was no point in continuing. This testimony captures the flamethrower tank's true significance in the war's final months. It was not primarily a tool for killing enemy soldiers, though it proved devastatingly effective in that role. It was primarily a tool for destroying enemy morale, for demonstrating to Wehrmacht forces that continued resistance was pointless not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they faced an enemy with the capacity to develop weapons against which courage and skill provided no defense. It was a weapon of persuasion masquerading as a weapon of destruction, designed to convince German soldiers to surrender by confronting them with the futility of any alternative. The effectiveness of this psychological strategy becomes clear in the surrender statistics from the war's final months. In sectors where flamethrower tanks were deployed, German surrender rates increased by factors of 3 to 5 compared to sectors facing only conventional Allied forces. Units that had resisted sustained attacks for days or weeks collapsed within hours when flamethrower tanks appeared. The weapon accelerated the Wehrmacht's terminal disintegration, helping to bring about the regime's collapse weeks or possibly months earlier than might have occurred through conventional combat alone. By destroying enemy morale more effectively than any amount of artillery bombardment or conventional tank assault, the flamethrower tank helped save Allied lives, the ultimate justification for any weapon system in wartime. But this justification carried uncomfortable implications about the nature of humane warfare. The flamethrower tank saved Allied lives by inflicting horrific deaths on enemy soldiers, and by traumatizing survivors so severely that they lost their will to resist. It achieved its strategic purpose precisely by being so horrible in application that enemy soldiers preferred surrender to the possibility of facing it. This created a moral calculus where the weapon's very cruelty became the source of its humanitarian justification. It saved more lives than it cost by being terrible enough to convince enemies to stop fighting. The Geneva Conventions and traditional just war theory offered no clear framework for evaluating weapons whose strategic value derived from their psychological, rather than their purely kinetic effects. The German soldiers who surrendered at Jebsheim and elsewhere would spend the rest of their lives carrying the memory of what they had witnessed. For many, the experience became the defining moment of their war service, more significant than battles they had fought, more memorable than victories they had achieved, more influential in shaping their post-war worldview than any ideological conditioning they had received during the Nazi years. In memoirs and oral histories conducted decades after the war, veterans consistently identified their exposure to flamethrower attacks as the moment when they understood that Germany had lost not just the current battle but the entire war, that continued resistance was pointless, that surrender offered the only rational path forward. This memory would become part of Germany's collective processing of the war experience in subsequent decades. The flamethrower tank joined other symbols of American military dominance, strategic bombing campaigns, unlimited artillery support, the atomic bomb, in the catalog of weapons that explained and justified German defeat. It allowed veterans to frame their surrender not as personal failure or cowardice, but as rational response to overwhelming technological superiority. The weapon became part of the narrative that enabled German society to accept defeat without completely abandoning belief in German military competence, by suggesting that the Wehrmacht had been defeated not by better soldiers, but by better weapons, not by tactical deficiencies, but by industrial disparities impossible to overcome through superior soldiering. This narrative served important psychological and social functions in post-war German society, but it also obscured certain truths about the war and its outcomes. The flamethrower tank was indeed a terrifying and effective weapon, but Germany's defeat stemmed from strategic decisions made long before the first flame tank rolled off American assembly lines. The regime's choice to initiate aggressive war against multiple opponents, its failure to secure access to necessary resources, its allocation of industrial capacity to ideological projects rather than military production. These factors determined the war's outcome far more than any single weapon system. The flamethrower tank accelerated German defeat, but it did not cause that defeat. It was a symptom of American industrial dominance, not the source of that dominance. But for the soldiers who experienced it directly, this broader strategic context was irrelevant. What mattered was the immediate, visceral reality of watching comrades burn, and understanding that no amount of training or courage or tactical skill could protect them from meeting the same fate. What mattered was the realization that they could either surrender or die, that those were the only options left, that all the other choices that had seemed available hours or days earlier had been foreclosed by the appearance of a single weapon. The tank had reduced their situation to binary simplicity, surrender or burn. When faced with that choice, made immediate and concrete by the screaming of burning men and the chemical smell of napalm, almost all chose surrender. The aftermath and legacy. The war in Europe would end 4 months after the engagement at Jebsheim. German forces would continue fighting, continue inflicting casualties on advancing Allied armies, continue defending Positio NS with varying degrees of effectiveness. But the fundamental dynamic had shifted. Wehrmacht soldiers increasingly understood that they were fighting to delay inevitable defeat rather than to achieve possible victory. The flamethrower tank became one symbol among many of why this defeat was inevitable, evidence of Allied technological sophistication and industrial capacity that Germany could not match. In the post-war period, the weapon would largely fade from popular memory, overshadowed by more spectacular technologies like the atomic bomb or more numerous systems like strategic bombers. But its impact on the specific soldiers who experienced it remained profound. In oral histories and memoirs, German veterans consistently described their exposure to flamethrower attacks as transformative moments, points where their understanding of the war and their role in it underwent fundamental revision. Some described it in quasi-religious terms, as a revelation or awakening. Others used more clinical language, speaking of the collapse of illusions or the destruction of morale. But nearly all agreed that the experience marked a decisive break between the soldiers they had been before witnessing the weapon and the men they became after. This transformation extended beyond individual psychology to broader questions about the nature of modern warfare and the relationship between technological capacity and military outcomes. The flamethrower tank demonstrated that industrial democracies, when threatened, would develop and deploy weapons of extraordinary destructive power regardless of their humanitarian implications. It showed that technological innovation could trump traditional military virtues of courage and skill. It suggested that future conflicts would be decided not by the quality of individual soldiers, but by the sophistication of the weapons systems they operated and the industrial capacity that produced those systems. These lessons would shape military doctrine and strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The recognition that technological superiority could render traditional military skills obsolete drove massive investments in defense research and development. The understanding that psychological impact could exceed kinetic effects influenced the design of new weapon systems. The acknowledgement that industrial capacity determined strategic outcomes shaped geopolitical competition and alliance structures. In these ways, the flamethrower tank's legacy extended far beyond the specific battlefields where it was deployed, influencing how nations thought about warfare and military preparedness for generations. But perhaps the weapon's deepest legacy lay in what it revealed about the societies that developed and deployed it. The flamethrower tank was not a weapon of desperation built by a losing side. It was a sophisticated tool created by the world's most powerful industrial economy to solve specific tactical problems. Its development required extensive research, complex engineering, substantial resource allocation, and bureaucratic processes that could move innovations from concept to battlefield deployment. That such effort went into creating a weapon whose primary purpose was burning enemy soldiers alive, that this investment was made alongside countless other military development projects, said something profound about the nature of industrial warfare and the societies that waged it. It suggested that liberal democracies, when faced with existential threats, would prove every bit as ruthless as totalitarian regimes in developing and deploying destructive weapons, that they would set aside peacetime moral constraints in favor of whatever methods proved most effective at achieving military victory, that they possessed the industrial and technological capacity to bring their full weight to bear on tactical problems that other nations would have to accept as unsolvable. The flamethrower tank embodied these truths in concentrated form, a weapon that saved Allied lives by inflicting terrible deaths on enemy soldiers, justified through the logic of total war and technological superiority. For the German soldiers who surrendered at Jebsheim and similar engagements, these abstract strategic considerations mattered less than the immediate reality of survival. They had faced a choice between certain death and surrender, and they had chosen life. In the POW camps and in the years that followed, they would process that choice through various frameworks: shame at having failed their comrades, relief at having survived, anger at leadership that had put them in impossible situations, gradually dawning understanding of the war's larger moral dimensions. But all of these complex emotions and interpretations grew from a single foundational experience: the moment when they watched liquid fire consume their defensive positions and understood, with terrible clarity, that their war was over. That moment, those 5 minutes outside Jebsheim on a frozen January morning, contained in compressed form the essential truth that would define the war's final phase and its aftermath. Industrial capacity had triumphed over military tradition. Technological innovation had rendered tactical skill obsolete. Democratic nations had proven capable of matching or exceeding totalitarian ruthlessness while bringing vastly superior resources to bear. The flamethrower tank was not just a weapon. It was a message about the nature of modern warfare and the futility of resisting societies that could harness industrial might in service of military objectives. The soldiers who received that message did not require complex ideological instruction to understand its implications. They saw, in those 5 terrible minutes, what they were fighting against: not just American soldiers or Allied armies, but the full weight of industrial modernity itself. The 20th century weaponized and directed against military forces organized along 19th century lines. In the face of that realization, surrender became not an act of cowardice, but a recognition of reality. Not a betrayal of duty, but an acknowledgement that duty had become meaningless when it required dying for a cause that technology had rendered unachievable. The snow continued falling on the field outside Jebsheim long after the battle ended, gradually covering the scorched earth and the positions where men had died or surrendered. Within weeks, other battles would rage across these same fields as Allied forces continued their advance toward the Rhine. Within months, the war would end and the long work of reconstruction would begin. Within years, the specific details of the engagement would fade from memory except in after-action reports and scattered personal accounts. But the essential truth that 5 minutes of flame had burned into German consciousness would endure, that their war against industrial democracy had been hopeless from its inception, that courage and skill could not overcome technological disadvantage, that the future belonged to nations that could harness science and industry in service of strategic objectives. This truth, purchased in fire and terror on a frozen January morning, would shape how generations understood not just the war but the nature of power in the modern world. The flamethrower tank had demonstrated, with brutal efficiency, that the age of the warrior, a victory achieved through superior individual skill and collective will, had given way to the age of the engineer, where outcomes were determined in laboratories and factories long before soldiers met on battlefields. For the men who surrendered at Jebsheim, this realization came at the cost of watching their comrades burn. For their nation, it would come at the cost of total defeat and the necessity of complete strategic reorientation. But the lesson, however terrible its teaching, was clear. In modern warfare, technological capacity was destiny, and no amount of courage could overcome its absence. The flame consumed men and positions and illusions with equal thoroughness. In its light, stripped of ideology and propaganda and self-deception, German soldiers saw their situation with terrible clarity. And they surrendered not because they lacked courage, but because they had finally understood what courage was insufficient to overcome. That understanding, more than any military defeat, marked the true end of their war.